There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Many episodes ago, I ran a series of shows that focused on pre-Darwinian thinkers, those individuals who tempted fate and reputation to explore how living things may have evolved. And some of those writers were Benoit de Maillet and Patrick Matthews, and they wondered aloud and in their works about our origins. Some wrote anonymously at first, like Robert Chambers and Charles Darwin's own grandfather Erasmus. Others did so openly and at their own peril. Denis Diderot comes to mind. Now, I by no means covered them all in that little series, so you can consider this episode another chapter. The French city of Saint-Malo has an interesting past. You could call it a checkered past. In 1590, it declared itself an independent republic, one that was autonomous from France. Now, that lasted for 3 years. Saint-Malo sits on the northern coast of France along the English Channel, and it's essentially an island. The city itself is surrounded by walls, pretty large walls, and in its early days, it was home to the Corsairs. Now, the Corsairs were basically legalized pirates as far as the French crown was concerned. And if you were an enemy of France and sailing the open waters, you were fair game for the Corsairs. The spoils were auctioned off and the Corsairs were entitled to keep a good portion of the proceeds. Needless to say, they were very well off. Now, it was into this world of privateer pirates that Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis was born in 1698. Maupertuis' family were wealthy and socially connected. Now, his family's status allowed young Pierre-Louis to enjoy the finer things in life. For him, this was math. Math, to Maupertuis, was as essential to life as the air that we breathe. It moved him like no other pursuit did, so much so that he threw himself into championing the work of Isaac Newton. Newton had died less than a decade before Maupertuis was even born. Newton was an Englishman, and his theories were still being debated in France at the time. Maupertuis sought to correct that, or to at least swing the pendulum of favor back Newton's way. Now, one of Maupertuis' early mathematical endeavors and eventual victories was to argue, based on Newtonian physics, that the Earth was oblate. Oblate meaning that it's somewhat of a flattened sphere. Imagine taking a not fully inflated basketball and pressing down on it. The other side of the argument was of the opinion that the Earth was prolate. And now take that same basketball, hold it between your two hands and press inward. Maupertuis was, of course, right, and he was celebrated for that. Maupertuis' expertise in math eventually landed him positions as director of the Academy of Sciences in Paris and also as president of the Berlin Academy, the latter being an odd position since Maupertuis himself did not speak any German whatsoever. It was a position made even more precarious when France and Germany went to war between the years of 1756 and 1763. History knows it as the 7 Years' War, essentially one of the first world wars. The math wasn't the only thing that fascinated Maupertuis. Life did. Or to be more specific, the origin and evolution of life. Math may hold the keys to unlocking the secrets of the universe, but when it comes to the secrets of life, its keys didn't quite fit. Math was perfect when it came to a lock that required a single key, even an elaborately chiseled key. But when it came to life, that was more of a combination lock with a multitude of dials with hidden numbers and secret codes. At the time, the subject of life in its beginnings fell to natural theologians to explain, which they did, in no uncertain terms, much like Paley would do at the beginning of the 19th century. The natural theologians of Maupertuis' day pointed to the Creator. God was the grand designer behind it all. A frog was a frog and had always been a frog. Any resemblance to another animal or species was simply the case of a design being reused and tweaked. According to the theologians, God gave many animals 4 legs, and he reserved his bipedal designs for those animals of higher intellects. His crowning achievement, of course, being us. Now, Maupertuis didn't buy any of it. There were too many inconsistencies in logic as far as that argument was concerned. He was a mathematician after all. Now, if there was a creator, finding the keys to his work had to involve careful study of the facts and an examination of the natural world with critical eyes.
Chance, one would say, produced an innumerable multitude of individuals.
Now, this was his first premise, one that he introduced in his 1745 work, Venus Physique. It was chance that started it all. Life simply popped into being. It didn't require a creator, per se, it just happened. Organic matter was self-organizing, and from that moment, when those very first life forms began to crawl across the planet's surface, from that moment, things began to happen. Once those first forms popped into existence,
a small number found themselves constructed in such a manner that the parts of the animal were able to satisfy its needs.
And what happens when those parts satisfy the animal's needs? Well, it persists, it propagates, and it self-replicates. Those animals and plants were the lucky ones. Others weren't so lucky.
In another infinitely greater number, there was neither fitness nor order.
These poor individuals were quickly pushed aside by those better able to satisfy their needs. And what happened to those less fortunate individuals?
All of these latter have perished. Animals lacking a mouth could not live. Others lacking reproductive organs could not perpetuate themselves.
"114 years later, Charles Darwin would raise a similar argument in the pages of On the Origin of Species, only in a more eloquent way and with mountains of evidence based on decades of work.
There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved."
As did Darwin, Maupertuis also wanted to understand how organisms changed. Once they had changed, they would either survive long enough to reproduce, or they wouldn't. But in a changing environment, what was it that prompted the changes? Could it be mutations? And if so, could those mutations be passed on? And so like Darwin, Lamarck, and others were to do, Maupertuis focused on heredity. Specifically pangenesis, which involved the passing of particles to an organism's offspring. Darwin was later to call them gemmules. Now, these particles accounted for specific traits, and each child received some from its mother and some from its father. Gemmules that were mixed together to create new variations in form. But not, as some were later to claim, by blending. These traits were unique and they stayed unique. You were just the recipient of the trait that won out for expression. Now, to prove this, Maupertuis pointed to families that inherited an extra finger. This is known in today's medical terms as polydactyly. Having offspring exhibit this anomaly meant that there was a particle being passed on that had to account for this specifically. It wasn't the result of blending. It was the result of a unique and inheritable feature. And this feature may contribute to an individual being
constructed in such a manner that the parts of the animal were able to satisfy its needs.
In a true show of forward thinking, Maupertuis also considered the entire history of the planet while writing about the transmutation and propagation of certain species. From its spontaneous and inspired beginnings, life has marched forward. Many species have been left behind, perhaps many more than are present in this world. We, in our limited and hampered ability to see into the past, will be forever unaware of them.
The species we see today are but the smallest part of what blind destiny has produced.
On July 27, 1759, at the age of 60, Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis joined the organisms which had passed into the shadows of time before him. He left behind no wife to mourn his passing nor children to carry on his genes, but what he did leave us with are his words, and sometimes that's enough to be remembered by. Evolution Talk is written and produced by myself, Rick Coast, and the music in today's episode was composed and performed by Kevin MacLeod. Now, support for Evolution Talk comes from you, simply by listening. And if you enjoyed this show, please share it with somebody. And if you want to help the show continue, if you're a patron of the arts, please consider supporting the show at evolutiontalk.com/support. As always, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
Well, blow me down. A pirate ship.
15 men on a dead man's chest. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Drake and the devil had done for the rest. Yo-ho-ho.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.